If you had to choose a mother in front of the entire world, would you choose love or status? The chandeliers burned gold across the ballroom, casting soft light over silk gowns, diamond necklaces, and carefully practiced smiles as the city's most elite women stood in a perfect semicircle, each one waiting, calculating, ready to become Mrs. Hayes, while at the center of it all stood Alexander Hayes, billionaire CEO, expression unreadable, hands clasped behind his back like a man negotiating a merger instead of a family, and beside him, small and silent in a tailored navy suit, his 7-year-old son Ethan, whose fingers twitched slightly as the whispers around him grew louder, sharper, heavier, the kind of whispers children aren't supposed to understand but always do. And then Alexander's voice cut clean through the room, calm, controlled, undeniable. Go ahead, Ethan, choose. A ripple of anticipation spread instantly, heels shifting against polished marble, champagne glasses pausing midair, every pair of eyes locking onto the boy as if he were about to crown a queen, and one by one, the women leaned forward just enough, smiles softening, voices lowering into honeyed tones. Hi, sweetheart, one said gently, crouching just enough to seem approachable while her diamond bracelet caught the light like a signal flare. I love children, another added with a laugh too. Rehearsed, we could go shopping together. Wouldn't that be fun? And Ethan didn't move, didn't smile, didn't answer, his eyes drifting, not across the women, but past them, past the shimmer, past the expectation, towards something no one else in the room seemed to notice, or perhaps chose not to notice, at the far edge of the grand staircase where the light didn't quite reach, where a woman in a simple black uniform stood holding a silver tray, shoulders slightly hunched as if trying to take up less space, her dark skin catching only a faint glow from the chandeliers, her name tag small and almost invisible, Naomi Carter, and she wasn't supposed to be part of this moment. She was supposed to disappear into it, just another staff member blending into the background of wealth she didn't belong to. And yet Ethan's gaze locked onto her with a clarity that made his small chest rise and fall a little faster, as if he had finally found something real in a room full of performances. Sir, a sharp voice cut in from behind Naomi, one of the event coordinators stepping close with a tight smile. Staff shouldn't be visible during the selection. And Naomi nodded quickly, lowering her eyes, already turning to leave, because she knew this rule, knew this world, knew exactly where she stood in it. But before she could take a single step, a small voice broke through everything, clear, steady, impossible to ignore. Wait. The room stilled, conversation snapping shut like doors, heels freezing mid-step, and Ethan moved, not toward the women in silk and diamonds, but toward the staircase, his polished shoes echoing softly as he walked past millions of dollars worth of expectation without a second glance. And Naomi looked up just in time to see him coming straight for her, confusion flickering across her face. You're not supposed to, she started softly. But he didn't stop, didn't hesitate, his small hand reaching out and wrapping around hers, warm, certain, grounding. And then he turned back toward the room, toward the women, toward his father, and said the two words that shattered the entire evening. I choose her. For a heartbeat, nothing happened, no one breathed, no one moved. And then the reaction came all at once, a wave of disbelief, a few sharp laughs that tried to disguise shock as amusement, one woman covering her mouth as if it were a joke that had gone too far, another whispering, "This can't be serious," while a third let out a quiet, cutting, "He doesn't understand." But Ethan didn't let go, his grip on Naomi tightening slightly, as if he could feel the pressure building around them, as if he knew that if he let go, the world would pull her away. And Naomi's heart pounded so loudly she was sure everyone could hear it, her mind racing, her instinct screaming at her to step back, to apologize, to disappear, because this wasn't her place. It never had been. But before she could say anything, before she could pull her hand free, Alexander Hayes finally moved, a single step forward, his eyes fixed not on the crowd, not on the socialites, but on his son, studying him with a depth that stripped away the performance he had worn all evening. And then, slowly, deliberately, he spoke. Then she stays. The words landed heavier than any announcement, heavier than any contract, and the room shifted. Again, this time with tension sharp enough to taste. Because this wasn't part of the plan. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. And yet no one dared to openly challenge him. Not yet. Not while the most powerful man in the room had just drawn a line no one expected. And Naomi stood there frozen, caught between a child's unwavering choice and a world that had already decided she didn't belong. Her fingers still wrapped in Ethan's small hand as the weight of every gaze in the room pressed down on her. And for the first time, Alexander Hayes looked directly at her. Not past her, not through her, but at her. And in that moment, something shifted, something none of them were prepared for, because this was no longer just a choice. It was the beginning of a story that would challenge everything they believed about power, status, and what it really means to be chosen. The silence did not fade. It thickened, stretching across the ballroom like something fragile about to crack as the women who had arrived certain of their place now stood frozen, their smiles slowly unraveling into tight expressions that could no longer hide their disbelief. And Naomi felt it first in the way the air changed around her, colder, sharper, every glance cutting just a little deeper than the last. Her fingers instinctively loosening around the silver tray she still held until Ethan's small hand tightened around hers again, grounding her before she could pull away, and somewhere behind them a soft, controlled laugh broke the tension. "Alexander, surely this is not what you had in mind," one of the socialites said, her voice smooth but edged, stepping forward in a gown that shimmered like liquid gold, her eyes flicking over Naomi in a way that did not bother to hide judgment. "Your son is confused," another added quickly. "He is a child. He does not understand what is appropriate." And a quiet murmur of agreement followed, building like a wave, subtle but intentional, the kind of pressure that had shaped rooms like this for generations. And Naomi felt her chest tighten, because she knew exactly what they were saying without saying it, knew the weight of it, the implication that she was invisible until she became unacceptable, and she swallowed hard, finally finding her voice, soft but steady. "I think there has been a misunderstanding," she said, gently trying to ease her hand free. "I should go," but Ethan shook his head immediately, stepping closer to her, his voice small but firm. "No." And when she looked down at him, she saw something that made her pause, not stubbornness, not defiance, but something quieter, something deeper, recognition, as if he had already decided that letting go was not an option. And across from them Alexander watched everything unfold, his expression unreadable to anyone else in the room. But inside, something shifted, because this was not part of any plan he had made, not part of any strategy designed to satisfy investors or family expectations. This was unpredictable, inconvenient, and yet undeniably real, and that made it dangerous in a way he could not immediately control. "Ethan," he said finally, his tone measured, drawing every eye back to him. "Do you understand what you are doing?" And the boy did not hesitate. "Yes," he answered, his grip tightening slightly around Naomi's hand. "They do not see me," he added, his voice softer now, but somehow louder than anything else that had been said that night, and a ripple moved through the room again. Not laughter this time, but something closer to discomfort, because truth, when spoken simply, had a way of exposing everything people preferred to ignore. And Naomi felt her breath catch as she looked at him, her heart pulling in a way she was not prepared for, because she knew that feeling, knew what it meant to stand in a room where people looked through you instead of at you. And for a moment she forgot where she was, forgot the rules, the hierarchy, the invisible line she was never meant to cross, until a sharp voice cut through again, louder now, no longer pretending to be polite. "This is inappropriate," the woman in gold said, stepping closer to Alexander, her tone tightening. "You cannot seriously consider this." And the word "this" hung heavy in the air, stripped of any attempt to disguise what it meant, and Alexander's jaw tightened just slightly, a flicker of something controlled passing through his expression before he responded, calm but firm. "I already have," he said, and the room stilled once more, the power in his voice undeniable, but not enough to erase the tension that now pulsed beneath every polite smile, and Naomi felt it, all pressing in, the weight of expectations, the judgment, the disbelief, and she knew she did not belong here, not in this moment, not in this role, and yet she could not ignore the small hand still holding on to hers, could not ignore the quiet certainty in Ethan's eyes, and it unsettled her more than anything else, because it asked something of her she was not sure she could give. "Sir," she said softly, finally looking up at Alexander, her voice respectful but edged with hesitation. "I am just here to work." And for the first time, something in his gaze shifted, not dismissal, not indifference, but recognition, as if he was seeing her not as part of the background, but as a variable he had not accounted for. And that realization lingered between them for a brief moment before the noise of the room began to rise again. Whispers turning sharper, more pointed. A few phones discreetly lifted as the story began to write itself in real time, and Alexander knew exactly what that meant. Headlines, speculation, scrutiny, everything he had built placed under a microscope because of a single unexpected choice. And yet when he looked at his son, at the unwavering way Ethan stood beside Naomi, he understood something just as clearly. Walking this back would cost him something far greater. "The evening is over," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the rising noise with quiet authority. And the room fell silent again, stunned by the abrupt shift. "Thank you for coming," he added, already turning away from the crowd as if the decision required no further explanation. And one by one the socialites began to gather their things, their smiles now tight, their whispers no longer hidden as they moved toward the exit, casting final glances over their shoulders at the scene they could not quite believe. And Naomi stood there, still holding Ethan's hand, as the room slowly emptied, the grandeur fading into something quieter, more uncertain, until it was just the three of them left beneath the dimming chandeliers. And for a moment no one spoke, the silence no longer filled with expectation, but with something else entirely, something unspoken and unresolved. And then Ethan looked up at her again, his voice barely above a whisper. "You are not going to leave, right?" And Naomi felt her chest tighten, because she did not know the answer. And when she looked up at Alexander, she realized something else just as unsettling. Neither did he. The mansion felt different once the doors closed, as if the silence inside carried more weight than the noise that had filled it just minutes before. And Naomi stood at the edge of the grand foyer, unsure where to place her hands, her thoughts, even her presence, because everything about this moment felt like it did not belong to her. Not the marble floors stretching beneath her worn shoes, not the towering ceilings, not the man standing a few feet away watching her with a gaze she could not quite read. And yet Ethan had not let go, his small fingers still wrapped around hers as if that single connection was the only thing holding the evening together. "You are not going to leave, right?" he repeated, his voice quieter now, almost fragile. And Naomi's throat tightened because she had spent years learning how to leave before she was asked to, how to step back before she was pushed, how to disappear before she became a problem. And everything in her told her to do exactly that now. To gently free her hand, to offer a polite apology, to return to the place she was expected to occupy. But instead she hesitated, and that hesitation alone felt like crossing a line she could not uncross. "Ethan," Alexander said, his tone calm, but carrying that familiar authority, "go upstairs." And for a moment the boy did not move, his eyes shifting between them as if he could sense that something important was happening, something he did not want to interrupt. "I will be right there," Alexander added, softer this time. And after a brief pause Ethan finally nodded, though his hand lingered in Naomi's for 1 second longer before slipping away, leaving behind a warmth that felt strangely difficult to ignore. And as his small footsteps disappeared up the staircase, the silence returned, heavier now, more personal, and Naomi exhaled slowly, finally setting the tray down on a nearby table just to give her hands something to do, something to steady herself. "I am sorry," she said, quietly, not looking directly at him yet. "That should not have happened." And Alexander watched her for a moment before responding. "It already did," he said, his voice even, not dismissive, not harsh, simply stating a fact that could not be undone. And Naomi nodded slightly, because she understood that better than anyone. Some moments changed everything whether you wanted them to or not. "I can explain to the staff," she continued, her tone returning to something more formal, more controlled. "It will not happen again." And there it was, the instinct to fix things, to smooth them over, to make herself smaller, so the world could remain comfortable. And for a brief second Alexander said nothing, studying her in a way that felt different from before, as if he was trying to understand not just what she was saying, but why she was saying it that way. And then he stepped closer, not enough to invade her space, but enough to shift the distance between them. "You think this is about staff protocol," he said, and Naomi finally looked up, meeting his eyes. "Is it not?" she asked softly, and something in her tone carried more than the words themselves, a quiet challenge wrapped in politeness. And Alexander held her gaze for a moment before answering. "No," he said simply, and that single word unsettled her more than any criticism could have, because it meant this was not something she could solve by stepping back into her role. "Then what is it about?" she asked, her voice steadier now even as her heart beat faster, and Alexander exhaled slowly, as if choosing his words with more care than he was used to. "It is about a decision that affects more than just tonight," he said, and Naomi felt a flicker of unease, because she knew decisions like that were not meant for people like her. "I am not part of that decision," she replied quickly, almost instinctively, but he did not look away. "You are now," he said, and the certainty in his voice made it impossible to dismiss. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the weight of that statement settling between them, because acknowledging it meant stepping into something neither of them had planned, and Naomi's mind raced, trying to find a way out, a way to return to the safety of what she understood. "With respect," she said carefully, choosing each word. "Your son made a choice in the moment. Children do that. It does not mean he does not do things like that." Alexander interrupted, not sharply, but firmly enough to stop her, and she paused, taken slightly off guard by the quiet conviction in his voice. "He observes," he continued, his tone lower now, more personal. "He notices what others ignore." And Naomi felt something shift again, because she had seen that in Ethan's eyes, had felt it in the way he spoke, and it made this harder to dismiss as a simple misunderstanding. "That still does not make me the right person," she said, though the certainty in her voice had softened just slightly, and Alexander studied her for a moment before asking a question that caught her completely off guard. "Why not?" And Naomi blinked, her breath catching because she had expected many things, dismissal, correction, even anger, but not that. Not a question that forced her to say out loud what had always been understood without words. "Because this is not my world," she answered quietly, and there it was. The truth laid bare between them, simple, undeniable, and Alexander did not immediately respond, because he could see it now more clearly than before, not just the difference in status, but the years of unspoken boundaries that had taught her exactly where she was allowed to stand. And for the first time that night, he realized that the real challenge was not convincing anyone else in that ballroom. It was convincing her, and that realization changed something in him, something subtle but significant. "It might not be," he said finally, his voice quieter now, "but it is his." And Naomi felt her chest tighten at that, because suddenly this was not about wealth or status or expectation. It was about a child who had reached for her in a room full of people who never saw him, and she did not have an answer for that. Not yet. And as the silence settled again, both of them understood the same thing at the same time. This was no longer something that could be undone, only something that had to be faced. The house did not sleep that night, even though every light was dimmed and every hallway fell quiet, because something unseen had shifted beneath its polished surface, and Naomi felt it the moment she stepped into the small staff quarters at the back of the estate, the familiar space suddenly feeling unfamiliar, as if the walls themselves were watching her differently now, and she sat on the edge of the narrow bed, her hands clasped tightly together as she replayed the evening over and over again. The sound of Ethan's voice, the weight of his hand in hers, the way the entire room had turned on her in a single breath, and most of all, the way Alexander had looked at her, not with dismissal, but with something she could not easily define, and that unsettled her more than anything else, because it suggested possibility, and possibility was dangerous when you had spent your life learning your limits. And she exhaled slowly, shaking her head as if she could push the moment away, telling herself the same thing again and again. This is temporary. This is not real. This is not your place. But the words did not settle the way they usually did, and across the house, in a room filled with quiet luxury, Ethan sat on the edge of his bed, his small legs swinging slightly as he stared at the door, waiting. Because he had learned early in life that waiting often meant being forgotten, and tonight he refused to let that happen. And when the door finally opened and Alexander stepped in, loosening his tie as he crossed the room, Ethan's eyes lifted immediately, searching his father's face for something, anything. "She is staying, right?" he asked without hesitation, and Alexander paused for just a fraction of a second, not because he did not hear the question, but because he understood exactly what it meant, and he moved closer, sitting across from his son, his tone measured but softer than before. "This is not that simple," he said, and Ethan's expression shifted, not into confusion, but into something more knowing, more tired than a child his age should be. "It is to me," he replied quietly, and the simplicity of that answer lingered in the room, cutting through every complication Alexander had spent years mastering. And for a moment he said nothing, because he recognized something in his son that he had not fully acknowledged before, a clarity that did not bend under pressure. "Why her?" he asked finally, not as a challenge, but as a question he genuinely needed answered, and Ethan looked down at his hands for a second before speaking, his voice steady but small. "Because she talks to me like I matter," he said, and the words settled heavily between them, and Alexander felt something tighten in his chest, because that was not something he could dismiss, not something he could solve with logic or strategy. And for the first time that night, he saw the situation not as a disruption, but as a reflection, and it forced him to confront something he had been avoiding. And across the house, Naomi stood in front of the small mirror in her room, staring at her reflection as if she could find an answer there, her uniform still perfectly pressed, her posture still careful, but her eyes carrying something new, uncertainty mixed with something dangerously close to hope. And she shook her head again, reaching for the familiar routine that had always grounded her, folding her uniform for the next day, aligning everything in its place. But even that felt different now, because she knew the next day would not be like the ones before it. And as she turned off the light and lay down, staring at the ceiling, she could not ignore the question that had taken root in her mind. What if this changes everything? And the thought lingered long after she closed her eyes, and morning came faster than either of them expected. The house waking slowly with the quiet rhythm of routine, staff moving through hallways, coffee brewing in the kitchen, sunlight filtering through tall windows, and Naomi stepped back into that rhythm automatically, her movements precise, controlled, as if nothing had happened, as if the night before had been nothing more than a strange interruption. But the moment she stepped into the main hallway, she felt it again, the shift, the subtle glances, the whispers that stopped just before she could hear them fully, and she kept walking, her posture steady, refusing to react, because she knew how this worked, knew that the moment she showed discomfort, it would confirm every assumption already being made about her. And as she entered the dining room to set the table, she paused for just a second when she saw Alexander already there, standing by the window, his silhouette framed by morning light, and for a brief moment neither of them spoke, the silence carrying the weight of everything left unresolved from the night before. And then he turned, his gaze settling on her with that same intensity, and Naomi felt her breath catch. Despite herself, because she knew this conversation was coming, had been waiting for it, even as she hoped it would not happen. "We need to talk," he said, his tone calm, but leaving no room for avoidance. And Naomi nodded slowly, setting down the last plate with careful precision, as if the act itself could steady her. And when she finally looked up at him, she knew this was the moment where everything would either return to what it was or move into something she was not prepared for. And neither option felt entirely safe. Naomi did not sit when Alexander gestured toward the chair across from him, and that alone said more than any words could, because she understood instinctively that sitting would mean accepting a place in a conversation she had not agreed to be part of, and instead she remained standing, her posture straight, her hands lightly clasped in front of her, as if she were still performing her role, even though nothing about this moment felt routine anymore, and Alexander noticed it immediately. The distance she was maintaining, not physical, but something deeper, something built over years of knowing exactly where the line was drawn, and he did not comment on it, not yet, because he had learned that pushing too fast often meant losing control of the outcome. What happened last night, He began, his tone calm, measured, is already becoming public, and Naomi's eyes flickered slightly, not in surprise, but in recognition, because she had expected that, expected the whispers to turn into headlines, expected her name to be reduced to something simple, something convenient, and she nodded once. I understand, she said quietly, and Alexander watched her for a moment, studying the way she held herself, the way she did not ask questions, did not react beyond what was necessary, and it made him realize just how accustomed she was to situations where her voice did not change the outcome. Do you? He asked, and the question was not dismissive, but probing, and Naomi met his gaze this time, steady despite the tension in her chest. Yes, she answered. It will not reflect well on you. And there it was again, her instinct to center the situation around him, to minimize her own position, and Alexander exhaled slowly, because that was exactly the kind of thinking he needed to disrupt if this was going to work. This is not just about me, he said, and Naomi felt a small shift at that, something in his tone that suggested a different direction than she expected. Then what is it about? She asked, her voice still controlled, but carrying a hint of curiosity she had not intended to reveal, and Alexander stepped slightly closer to the table, resting his hands lightly against its surface as if grounding the conversation. It is about perception, he said, and control, and Naomi's brow furrowed just slightly, because those were not words she associated with something like this. The narrative is already forming, he continued. People will decide what last night meant whether we say anything or not. And Naomi understood that immediately, because she had seen it happen before, stories shaped without truth, conclusions drawn without context, and she felt a quiet tension settle in her chest. And what do you want them to believe? She asked, and Alexander held her gaze for a moment before answering. That it was intentional, and the words landed heavier than she expected, and for a second she did not respond, because she knew exactly what that implied. You want to turn this into something official, she said slowly, and Alexander did not hesitate. Yes, and the simplicity of his answer made her chest tighten, because this was no longer about a misunderstanding, this was a decision, and she shook her head slightly, the reaction immediate, instinctive, that is, not possible, she said, and for the first time her voice carried a trace of resistance, not loud, not confrontational, but firm enough to be heard. Why not? He asked again, and the question felt heavier this time, because now it demanded more than a simple answer. Because it is not real, she said, her words coming faster now. Because it started with a child making a choice in a moment that he does not fully understand. And because people like me do not suddenly become part of something like this without consequences. And Alexander listened without interrupting, his expression steady, but there was something in his eyes now that had not been there before, something more engaged, more present. And yet it already happened, he said quietly, and Naomi felt her breath catch again, because that was the part she could not argue with. You cannot control what they say, she added, trying to pull the conversation back to something practical, something safe. But you can correct it. And Alexander shook his head slightly. Correction invites more scrutiny, he said. But confirmation gives us control. And Naomi stared at him for a moment, because she realized then that he was not asking her to fix a mistake. He was asking her to step into a role, one that would change everything about how she was seen, how she lived, how she existed in this world, and the weight of that realization pressed down on her. And what does that role require? She asked, her voice quieter now, more cautious, and Alexander paused, because this was the moment that mattered, the moment where everything would either move forward or fall apart. It requires you to stay, he said, to be seen with us, to be part of this, publicly. And Naomi's chest tightened further, because she knew exactly what that meant, the scrutiny, the judgment, the assumptions that would follow her everywhere. For how long? She asked, and Alexander did not look away. Until it becomes real enough that no one questions it. And the answer hung in the air between them, heavy, complicated, impossible to ignore, and Naomi felt the room close and slightly, not physically, but emotionally, because she understood what he was offering, and what it would cost, and for a moment she said nothing, her mind racing through every reason to refuse, every instinct telling her to step back, to protect herself, to return to the safety of what she knew. But then she thought of Ethan, of the way he had looked at her, the way he had held her hand as if letting go was not an option, and that thought alone made everything more complicated. "This is not a game," she said finally, her voice steady but carrying the weight of her hesitation. "Not for him." And Alexander nodded once, because that was the one thing they both understood completely. "No," he said quietly, "it is not." And for the first time since the conversation began, they stood there not as employer and employee, not as CEO and staff, but as two people facing the same reality from very different sides, both aware that whatever decision came next would change everything, and neither of them could pretend otherwise. The room did not feel large anymore, even though sunlight still stretched across polished marble and glass like nothing had changed, because now every inch of space between them carried a question that neither of them could ignore, and Naomi stood there with her hands still clasped, her fingers pressing lightly into each other, as if she could anchor herself to something steady while everything else shifted beneath her, and Alexander watched her carefully, not rushing her, not interrupting the silence, because he understood that this was not a decision she would make lightly. Not someone who had spent years learning how to survive by staying within boundaries that had just been erased overnight. "You are asking me to become something I am not," she said finally, her voice quiet but clear, and Alexander did not deny it. "I am asking you to step into a role," he corrected, his tone measured, but Naomi shook her head slightly. "A role people like me are not given," she replied, and the truth in her words settled heavily between them, because this was not just about perception or media or reputation. This was about history, about unspoken rules that had existed long before either of them stood in this room. And Alexander held her gaze, not dismissing it, not challenging it, but acknowledging it in a way that was new even to himself. "Then maybe it is time those rules change," he said, and Naomi let out a small breath, almost a laugh, but without humor, because she had heard variations of that before, promises that sounded powerful but rarely reached people like her. "They do not change because someone decides they should," she said. "They change slowly, and usually not for people who are already expected to fail." And Alexander absorbed that, because it was not resistance for the sake of defiance. It was lived experience, and that made it harder to argue against. And for a moment he looked away, not to avoid her, but to think, to consider something beyond strategy, beyond control, and when he spoke again, his voice carried something different, less calculated, more honest. "I am not offering you an illusion," he said. "I am offering you a position that will be questioned, challenged, and scrutinized, but also protected." And Naomi's eyes narrowed slightly at that last word, "protected," she repeated, and Alexander nodded once. "By me," he said simply, and the weight of that statement lingered, because it was not a promise he made lightly, and Naomi could hear that, could feel the certainty behind it, but certainty from someone in his position did not erase the reality she knew. "Protection does not change how people see me," she said. "It does not change what they will say when I walk into a room like that again." And Alexander stepped closer, just enough that his presence felt more direct, more grounded. "No," he agreed, "but it changes what happens after they say it." And Naomi's breath caught slightly, because there was something in the way he said it that suggested he had already thought through every possible reaction, every possible consequence, and that only made this more real, more immediate. And she looked away for a moment, her mind racing, weighing everything she knew against everything being placed in front of her, and then she asked the question that mattered most. "And what happens when this ends?" she said, her voice softer now, but no less important, and Alexander did not answer immediately, because that was the one part he could not fully control, and they both knew it. "Then we decide how it ends," he said finally, and Naomi let out a slow breath, because that was not certainty, not really, but it was the closest thing to honesty she had been given in this entire conversation, and the silence returned again, but it felt different now, not empty, not uncertain, but full of something unresolved, something waiting, and before either of them could say anything more, the sound of small footsteps echoed from the hallway, light but unmistakable, and both of them turned instinctively as Ethan appeared in the doorway, still in his school clothes, his hair slightly out of place as if he had rushed, and his eyes moved immediately between them, searching. "Did you decide?" he asked, his voice carrying that same quiet urgency from the night before. And Naomi felt her chest tighten again, because suddenly this was no longer just a conversation between two adults navigating something complicated. It was a moment that would directly affect a child who had already chosen, who was already waiting for an answer, and she glanced at Alexander briefly, a silent question passing between them. But this time it was not his decision alone, and Ethan stepped a little closer, his gaze settling on Naomi. "You are staying, right?" he said, not as a demand, but as a hope he was trying very hard not to lose. And Naomi felt something shift inside her, something that made every logical argument feel smaller, less certain, and for a moment she said nothing, because she understood that whatever she said next would not just shape her own future, it would shape his as well. And the weight of that realization pressed down on her in a way she could not ignore, and when she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, but it carried a steadiness that had not been there before. "I have not decided yet," she said, and Ethan's expression flickered, disappointment brushing briefly across his face before he tried to hide it. And Naomi saw that too, saw the way he held himself together even when something mattered, and it made the choice in front of her feel even heavier, because now it was not just about stepping into a role. It was about whether she was willing to risk everything for something that might not last. And as the three of them stood there in that quiet room, one thing became clear to all of them. The next decision would not be easy, and it would not be small. The moment lingered longer than it should have, stretching between the three of them as if time itself was waiting for Naomi to make a choice she was not ready to give. And Ethan stood there watching her with a quiet hope that refused to disappear, even after her answer, even after the uncertainty. And Naomi felt it pressing against her, not as pressure, but as something far more difficult to ignore, expectation without demand. And that was what made it harder, because she could walk away from pressure. She had done it her entire life. But this was different, and she drew in a slow breath, steadying herself before speaking again. "I need time," she said, her voice calm but firm enough to hold its ground. And Ethan nodded slightly, though the disappointment in his eyes did not fully fade. "Okay," he replied, trying to sound stronger than he felt. And Alexander watched the exchange carefully, noting every detail. The way Naomi chose her words, the way Ethan responded, the way something unspoken had already begun to form between them, something that could not be reduced to strategy or perception. And it made the situation more complicated than he had anticipated, but also more real. And that realization stayed with him as Ethan finally turned and walked toward the hallway, slower this time, glancing back once before disappearing from view. And when the room fell quiet again, Naomi exhaled softly, as if she had been holding her breath longer than she realized. And Alexander did not speak immediately, giving her the space she had asked for, but also knowing that time alone would not resolve this. Not when the outside world was already moving faster than either of them could control. "You will not have long," he said finally, his tone not urgent, but grounded in reality. And Naomi nodded slightly, because she understood that this was not a decision she could delay indefinitely. And yet she also knew that rushing it would only lead to something she could not sustain. "I know," she said. And for a moment they stood there again, two people from entirely different worlds trying to navigate the same uncertain ground. And then Naomi turned slightly, preparing to leave, because she needed distance, needed space to think without his presence shaping every thought. But before she could take more than a step, his voice stopped her, "Naomi," and she paused, turning back just enough to meet his gaze. "If you walk away from this," he said, "it will not go back to what it was." And she felt the truth of that settle immediately, because she already knew it, had known it the moment Ethan took her hand, and she nodded once. "I understand," she replied, and this time there was no hesitation in her voice, because she did understand, fully, completely, and that was what made this decision so difficult. And with that, she left the room, her footsteps quiet but steady as she moved down the hallway, past the familiar spaces that no longer felt entirely the same. And once she was alone. Again, truly alone. The weight of everything she had been holding and finally surfaced. Not as panic, not as fear, but as something more complex, something that demanded she confront herself as much as the situation. and she stepped outside into the garden. The morning air cool against her skin, the sunlight softer here, filtered through trees that stood older than the house itself, and she walked slowly along the stone path, her mind replaying every moment, every word, every look, until the thoughts began to blur together, and she stopped near the edge of the fountain, resting her hands lightly against its cool surface as she stared into the water, searching for clarity that did not come easily, because this was not just about stepping into a different role. It was about stepping into a different version of herself, one she had never allowed herself to imagine. And that was where the real hesitation lived, not in what others would say, but in whether she believed she had the right to choose something more. And as she stood there, lost in thought, a small voice broke through the quiet. "You came back," and Naomi turned to see Ethan standing a few feet away, his expression softer now, less guarded, and she felt a small shift in her chest at the sight of him. Because even in uncertainty, she had not left, not yet. "I just needed some air," she said gently, and he nodded, stepping a little closer, his hands tucked into his pockets as if he was trying not to reach for her again. "I was worried," he admitted, and Naomi felt that familiar pull again, that quiet connection that had nothing to do with status or expectation. "You do not have to be," she said, her voice calm, and Ethan looked at her for a moment before asking, "Are you scared?" And the question caught her off guard, not because it was difficult, but because it was honest in a way adults rarely allowed themselves to be, and she hesitated, then answered truthfully, "Yes," and Ethan nodded, as if that made sense to him, as if fear was something he understood more than he should. "Me too," he said softly, and the simplicity of that shared truth shifted something between them, making the situation feel less like a performance and more like something real, something human. And Naomi felt her thoughts slow slightly, her perspective shifting, just enough to see the situation differently, not just as a risk, but as a possibility. And as she looked at Ethan standing there, waiting but not demanding, hoping but not forcing, she realized that whatever decision she made, it would not just define her place in this world, it would define the kind of person she chose to be in it. And that realization stayed with her long after the moment passed, because it was no longer just about whether she belonged. It was about whether she was willing to step forward and find out. The garden no longer felt like an escape. It felt like a threshold, and Naomi stood there with Ethan beside her, the quiet between them no longer heavy but meaningful, as if something unspoken had already begun to take shape. And for the first time since everything changed, she did not feel the immediate urge to step back, to retreat into the version of herself that had always been safer, and instead she looked at him, really looked at him, noticing the small details she had overlooked before. The way his shoulders carried a tension no child should have. The way his eyes searched for reassurance even when he tried to appear calm. And it made something inside her settle into place. Not completely, not without doubt, but enough to shift her thinking. "What happens if I stay?" she asked quietly, more to herself than to him. But Ethan answered anyway, his voice simple, certain. "Then you stay." And Naomi let out a soft breath, almost smiling despite herself, because only a child could make something so complicated sound that clear. And yet there was truth in it, a kind of truth that did not rely on status or expectation. And she straightened slightly, her posture changing in a way that felt small but significant, because for the first time she was not just reacting to what was happening. She was considering what she might choose. And across the estate, Alexander stood in his office, the city skyline stretching beyond the glass windows, his phone resting on the desk as notifications continued to appear one after another, headlines forming faster than he could respond to them, speculation already turning into narrative, and he did not need to read them to know what they said. He had seen this pattern before, how quickly a moment could be reshaped into something else entirely, and he exhaled slowly, pressing his fingers lightly against the edge of the desk as he considered the next step. Because this was no longer just a private matter, it was something that would define how he was seen, how his company was perceived, how every decision moving forward would be interpreted. And yet none of that felt as immediate as the conversation that had not yet reached its conclusion. And when he finally turned away from the window, he already knew what needed to happen next, not as a strategy, but as a decision. And back in the garden, Naomi felt the shift before she heard his footsteps. The presence of him approaching carrying a different weight now, not distant, not controlled, but deliberate. And she turned slightly as he stepped onto the stone path, his gaze moving between her and Ethan, taking in the moment without interrupting it. "I have made arrangements," he said, his voice calm but purposeful, and Naomi felt her chest tighten slightly, because she understood what that meant. This was moving forward, whether she had fully decided or not. "For what?" she asked, and Alexander did not hesitate. "For you to stay," he said, and the words landed with a finality that made the air feel different again, and Naomi held his gaze, not backing away, but not stepping forward either. "That is not your decision to make," she replied, and there was no hesitation in her voice this time, only clarity, and for a moment something almost like respect flickered in Alexander's expression, because she had not simply accepted what was offered, she had challenged it, and that mattered more than he expected. "No," he agreed, "it is yours," and the acknowledgement shifted something again, because it placed the choice fully in her hands, not as an obligation, not as an expectation, but as something she had the right to decide, and Ethan looked between them, sensing the change even if he did not fully understand it. And Naomi took a slow breath, her mind no longer racing in the same way, because now the question was not what would happen if she stayed, it was whether she was willing to face what would happen if she did. And she thought of the ballroom, the looks, the whispers, the way she had been reduced to something less in a matter of seconds, and she thought of Ethan, of the way he had reached for her without hesitation, without judgment, and then she thought of herself, of the life she had built by staying within boundaries that had never truly belonged to her, and for the first time, she allowed herself to consider what it would mean to step beyond them, not because someone asked her to, but because she chose to, and when she spoke, her voice was steady, grounded in something deeper than fear. "If I do this," she said, looking directly at Alexander now, "it will not be just for appearances," and he did not look away. "It cannot be," he replied, and Naomi nodded once, because that was the only way this could work, the only way she could justify stepping into something that would change everything. "And I will not be treated like something temporary," she added, and Ethan's eyes lit up slightly at that, even before Alexander responded, because he understood what it meant in the simplest way possible, and Alexander held her gaze for a moment before answering. "You will not be," and there was no hesitation in his voice, no room for doubt, and Naomi felt something settle into place. Not certainty, not completely, but enough to take the next step, and she exhaled slowly, the decision forming not as a sudden shift, but as something that had been building from the moment Ethan took her hand. "Then I will stay," she said, and the words changed everything, not just for the room, not just for the moment, but for all of them, and Ethan's reaction was immediate, his face breaking into something brighter, something lighter, as if a weight he had been carrying had finally lifted, and he stepped closer to her again, this time without hesitation, and Naomi felt it too, the shift, the difference, the moment where choice became reality, and Alexander watched them both, understanding in that instant that this was no longer something he could fully control, and perhaps for the first time, he did not try to, because this was not just a decision, it was the beginning of something none of them could fully predict. The decision did not echo loudly, it settled quietly, but its impact moved faster than any sound ever could, because by the time Naomi stepped back into the house, the shift had already begun, not just in how she saw herself, but in how the world was about to see her, and she felt it immediately in the way the staff paused just slightly longer than usual, the way conversations lowered instead of stopping, as if everyone was adjusting to a new reality they had not been prepared for, and Naomi walked through it steadily, her posture no longer shrinking, not expanding either, but grounded in something new, something chosen, and Ethan stayed close beside her, his small steps matching hers with quiet confidence, as if her presence alone had changed the rhythm of his world. And across the house, phones continued to buzz, messages stacking faster than they could be answered, because the story had already broken beyond the walls of the estate, and Alexander stood in the same place he had been earlier, but everything about him felt different now, less controlled, more aware, because this was no longer a situation he could simply manage, it was something he had to stand behind, and when Naomi entered the room with Ethan beside her, he looked up, and for a brief moment there was no hierarchy in his gaze, only recognition of the decision that had just been made. "We will need to make a statement," he said, his tone calm but direct, and Naomi nodded slightly, because she expected that, expected the world outside to demand explanation. But this time she did not step back from it. "Then we make one," she replied, and the simplicity of her answer shifted something again, because it was not hesitant, not uncertain, it was aligned, and Alexander studied her for a moment before adding, "It will not be easy." And Naomi held his gaze. "It was never going to be," she said, and Ethan looked between them, not fully understanding the weight of their words, but sensing the change in a way that made him stand a little taller, a little more certain. And as the morning moved forward, the house transformed in subtle but undeniable ways, arrangements being made, schedules adjusted, the quiet machinery of a life shifting to accommodate something new. And Naomi found herself moving through spaces she had once only passed through, now standing in them, now being seen in them, and each step carried a different kind of awareness, not of being watched, but of being present in a way she had never allowed before. And later that afternoon, as preparations for a public appearance began to take shape, she stood in front of a mirror that did not belong to the staff quarters, a space larger, brighter, unfamiliar, and she looked at her reflection, not searching for approval, not questioning what she saw, but trying to understand the version of herself she was stepping into. And the door opened softly behind her, and Alexander stepped in, pausing just inside, as if giving her the option to acknowledge him first. And when she turned, their eyes met in the mirror before meeting directly. And for a moment neither of them spoke, because this was no longer about convincing or negotiating. It was about alignment. "Are you ready?" he asked finally. And Naomi considered the question carefully, not rushing to answer, because readiness was not something that came easily in situations like this. And yet she knew that waiting for certainty would only hold her back. "I am willing," she said, and the distinction mattered, and Alexander nodded once, understanding it without needing further explanation. And as they stepped out together, the world outside was already waiting, cameras, questions, assumptions forming, before they even appeared, and Naomi felt the weight of it as they moved toward the entrance. But this time she did not retreat from it, did not look for a way to disappear, because she had already made her choice. And beside her, Ethan reached for her hand again, not out of fear, but out of connection, and she held it without hesitation. And when the doors opened and the noise of the outside world rushed in, she did not step back. She stepped forward, not as someone who had been chosen by circumstance, but as someone who had chosen to stand where she was. And in that moment, everything that followed would be shaped not just by what others believed, but by what she was willing to become. The doors had barely opened before the noise surged forward, voices overlapping, cameras flashing in rapid bursts that turned the entrance into a wall of light. And Naomi felt it hit her all at once, not as fear, but as intensity, the kind that demanded a response whether she was ready or not. And for a split second her instinct whispered to step back, to let Alexander move ahead, to return to the space behind him where she had always existed. But Ethan's hand tightened around hers, small but steady, and that single connection anchored her, grounding her in the choice she had already made. And so she did not step back. She stepped forward with them, her shoulders straight, her gaze level, even as the questions began to rise. Is it true? Who is she? Is this official? The words blending together into a constant pressure that pushed against her from every direction. And Alexander did not immediately respond, not because he did not have an answer, but because he understood timing, understood that the first words spoken would define everything that followed. And when he finally raised his hand slightly, the crowd shifted just enough, the noise lowering into something more controlled, more focused, and he spoke with the same calm authority he carried into every room. "This is Naomi Carter," he said, his voice clear, deliberate. "She is part of my family." And the words landed with a weight that rippled through the crowd, because they were not vague, not open to interpretation, they were direct, and Naomi felt it. The shift in the way people looked at her, not entirely accepting, not even close, but no longer dismissing her as easily as before. And still the questions came, sharper now, more pointed. How did this happen? Is this a statement? What about the other candidates? And Naomi could feel the narrative forming again, trying to reshape the moment into something simpler, something easier to categorize. And for a second, she looked at Alexander, not for permission, but for alignment. And he met her gaze with a small, almost imperceptible nod, and that was enough. And when she spoke, her voice was not loud, but it carried, steady and clear. It happened because someone chose to see me, she said, and the simplicity of her words cut through the noise in a way that complexity never could. And for a moment the crowd paused, processing, recalibrating, and Ethan looked up at her, a small smile forming as if he recognized his own truth in her words. And Alexander watched her closely, because this was the part he could not script, the part that would either strengthen or unravel everything they were building. And as the questions continued, Naomi did not retreat, did not deflect. She answered what she could, held her ground when she needed to, and with each moment that passed, something shifted, not in the crowd entirely, but in herself, because she was no longer reacting to the situation, she was shaping it, and that realization settled into her with a quiet strength that had nothing to do with where she stood or who stood beside her. And after what felt like both seconds and hours, the moment eased just enough for them to move forward, stepping past the cameras, past the voices, into the waiting car that carried them away from the immediate storm. And as the door closed and the noise faded, the silence inside felt different, not empty, but earned. And Naomi exhaled slowly, her shoulders lowering just slightly as the tension released, and Ethan leaned gently against her side, his presence soft but constant, and Alexander sat across from them, his expression thoughtful, not distant, not calculating, but aware. "You handled that well," he said after a moment, and Naomi glanced at him briefly, then back toward the window where the city moved outside, unchanged and yet entirely different now. "I told the truth," she replied, and he nodded, because that was exactly what had made it work. And for a moment none of them spoke, the quiet settling into something almost peaceful, until Ethan broke it with a soft, almost curious question. "Does this mean it is real now?" And Naomi felt her chest tighten slightly, because that question held more weight than anything the reporters had asked, and she looked at Alexander, then back at Ethan, choosing her words carefully. "It means we are trying," she said, and Ethan considered that, then nodded slowly, as if that answer made sense to him. And outside the car, the city continued as it always did. But inside, something had changed, not just in how they were seen, but in how they were beginning to see each other. And as Naomi leaned back slightly, her reflection faint in the window, she realized that this was only the beginning, not of something simple, not of something easy, but of something real enough to challenge everything she thought she knew about where she belonged. And for the first time, that possibility did not feel like something to fear. It felt like something she was ready to face. The silence inside the car did not last long once the world outside caught up with them again, because by the time they returned to the estate, the ripple of that single appearance had already turned into something larger, something louder, and Naomi felt it before she even stepped out, the shift in energy, the weight of attention that now followed her not as background, but as focus. And when the car door opened, she did not hesitate this time, stepping out with the same steady composure she had found earlier, even as her heart reminded her that this was still new, still uncertain. And inside the house the atmosphere had changed completely, no longer quiet and routine, but active, purposeful, voices moving through hallways, staff adjusting schedules, assistants speaking in low but urgent tones. And for a moment Naomi paused just inside the entrance, taking it all in, because this was no longer a private decision. It was something that had already begun to reshape everything around it. And Ethan stayed close beside her, his presence lighter now, as if the tension he had carried before had eased, and he looked up at her with a small, quiet confidence that made something in her settle again. And across the room Alexander stood speaking with one of his advisors, his posture still controlled, but his attention sharper, more engaged. And when he noticed Naomi and Ethan, he ended the conversation without hesitation, turning fully toward them as if they were now the priority that mattered most. "There is going to be resistance," he said without preamble, his voice calm but direct, and Naomi met his gaze without stepping back. "I expected that," she replied, and he studied her for a moment, as if measuring whether she truly understood what that meant, and before he could say more, another voice cut in, smooth but edged with something less polite. Resistance is an understatement. And Naomi turned to see a woman stepping forward from the far side of the room, dressed with the same polished elegance she had seen the night before, but this time there was no attempt to hide the judgment in her expression, and Naomi recognized her immediately, one of the women from the ballroom, the one who had spoken first when everything changed, and she moved closer now, her gaze fixed on Naomi with a kind of confidence that came from always being on the right side of power. "You have created quite the spectacle," she said, her tone light but cutting, and Naomi felt the words land, not as surprise, but as confirmation of what she had already anticipated, and she held her ground, her posture steady, her voice calm. "I did not create anything," she replied. "I responded to it." And the woman's lips curved slightly, not in amusement, but in something sharper. "That is a convenient way to see it," she said, glancing briefly at Alexander before returning her attention to Naomi. "But situations like this have consequences," and Naomi could feel the implication beneath the words. The warning dressed as observation, and she did not look away. "So do choices," she said, and for a brief moment the room stilled again, not because of volume, but because of presence, because Naomi had not lowered herself in the exchange, had not retreated into silence, and Alexander watched it all carefully, recognizing the shift not just in the conversation, but in Naomi herself, the way she was no longer reacting from a place of defense, but speaking from a place of ownership, and that mattered more than anything else unfolding around them. And the woman's expression tightened slightly, as if she had expected something easier, something more predictable. "You are stepping into something you do not understand," she said, and Naomi took a small breath before answering, her voice steady. "No," she said. "I understand exactly what this is." And there was no hesitation in her tone, no uncertainty, and that made the statement land differently, heavier, more grounded, and for a moment the woman said nothing, her gaze lingering as if reassessing something she had already decided. Before she finally stepped back, her composure returning, but the tension she had introduced remained, and as she moved away, the room slowly resumed its motion, but the moment did not disappear, it settled into the space, into the awareness of everyone present, and Naomi felt it too, not as pressure, but as confirmation, because this was the reality she had chosen, not a quiet transition, not an easy acceptance, but a challenge that would test every part of her, and beside her Ethan reached for her hand again, not because he needed reassurance, but because he understood, in his own way, that standing together mattered, and Naomi held his hand without hesitation, her grip steady, and Alexander stepped closer, his presence no longer distant, but aligned with hers. "This is only the beginning," he said quietly, and Naomi nodded once, because she knew that now, fully, completely. And as she looked around the room, at the people, the expectations, the resistance that had already begun to surface, she realized something that settled deeper than anything else. She was no longer standing on the edge of a decision. She was already inside it. And whatever came next would not be about whether she belonged. It would be about whether she was willing to stay and prove that she did. The tension did not fade after the confrontation. It deepened, settling into the walls of the house like something that refused to be ignored. And Naomi could feel it in every step she took, not as hesitation anymore, but as awareness, because now she understood exactly what she was walking into, and she did not turn away from it. And that was what changed everything. Because the moment she chose to stay, she also chose to face what came with it. And as the afternoon stretched into evening, the estate prepared for another gathering, smaller than the night before, more controlled, but no less significant, because this time it was not about selection, it was about confirmation, about reinforcing a narrative that had already begun to take shape. And Naomi stood in the same room where everything had started, but nothing about it felt the same, not the air, not the space, not even herself. And she looked at her reflection in the tall mirror near the staircase, not searching for validation, but measuring the distance between who she had been and who she was becoming. And that distance was no longer something she feared. It was something she was learning to stand within, and behind her the room slowly filled again, familiar faces returning, conversations layered with curiosity, skepticism, and something else that had not been there before, something closer to challenge. And Naomi did not avoid it. She stepped into it. Her movements calm, her presence steady, even as the whispers followed her. And across the room, Alexander moved through the crowd with the same composed authority. But there was a difference now, a shift in his attention, because his focus returned to Naomi again and again, not to manage the situation, but to stand within it with her. And Ethan remained close, his small presence no longer uncertain, but quietly confident, as if he had already accepted what others were still questioning. And when the moment came, it was not announced with grand gestures or dramatic silence. It unfolded naturally, Alexander stepping forward just enough to draw attention, his voice cutting through the layered conversations with calm precision. "I want to be clear," he said, and the room shifted immediately, the noise lowering, eyes turning, waiting, and Naomi stood beside him, not behind, not hidden, but present, and she felt the weight of every gaze again. But this time it did not push her back, it held her in place. "This is not temporary," he continued, his words deliberate, each one placed with intention. "Naomi Carter is not here by accident, and she is not leaving." And the statement settled over the room with a different kind of silence, not shock this time, but resistance meeting certainty, and Naomi felt it, the tension rising again, but she did not look away, did not lower herself under it, and instead she took a small step forward, aligning herself fully with the moment. And when she spoke, her voice carried not just calm, but conviction. "I did not step into this because it was easy," she said, and the room listened, not because they agreed, but because they could not ignore her anymore. "I stepped into it because it mattered," she continued, her gaze steady. "And I am not here to replace anything or anyone. I am here because I chose to stay." And the words landed differently than anything that had been said before, because they were not defensive, not reactive. They were rooted in ownership, and that shifted something again. Not in everyone, not completely, but enough to change the tone of the room. And for a moment no one spoke, the silence holding something new, something unresolved but no longer dismissive. And then Ethan's small voice broke through it, simple and clear. "She is already my family," he said, and the simplicity of it cut through everything else, leaving no space for interpretation. And Naomi felt her chest tighten, not with fear, but with something deeper, something that grounded her even as the world around her continued to shift. And Alexander glanced at his son briefly, then back at the room, and in that moment the three of them stood not as roles, not as positions, but as something forming, something real enough to challenge everything that had been assumed before. And the room began to move again slowly, conversations restarting, but different. Now, quieter, more measured, as if everyone was adjusting to a reality they could no longer easily dismiss. And Naomi stood there, no longer questioning whether she belonged in that space, but understanding that belonging was not something given, it was something claimed, and she had already taken the first step. And as the evening continued, she moved through the room not as someone being watched, but as someone being recognized, even if that recognition came with resistance, even if it came with doubt, because she had already accepted that, had already chosen to stand in it. And as she glanced briefly toward Alexander, she saw something in his expression that had not been there before, not control, not calculation, but respect, and that mattered more than anything else, because it meant this was no longer just a situation they were navigating, it was something they were building. And as the night settled into a quieter rhythm, one thing became clear to everyone in that room. This was not a moment that would pass, it was a shift that had already begun, and it was not going anywhere. The night did not end with applause or acceptance. It ended with something quieter, something more powerful, a shift that no one could quite define but no one could deny. And as the last guests left the estate and the doors closed behind them, the house returned to silence once more, but it was no longer the same silence as before. It carried weight now, meaning, and Naomi stood near the staircase, her reflection faint in the glass as she watched the empty room where everything had changed, and for a moment she allowed herself to feel it fully, not just the tension or the challenge, but the significance of what had happened, because she knew this was not just about being accepted into a different world, It was about redefining what that world allowed, and behind her soft footsteps approached, and she did not need to turn to know it was Alexander. His presence now familiar in a way it had not been before, and when he spoke, his voice was quieter than usual, stripped of the authority he carried in public. "You did not walk away," he said, and Naomi let out a small breath, almost a smile. "Neither did you," she replied, and for a moment they stood there, not as positions or roles, but as two people who had made a choice that neither of them could undo. And Alexander stepped closer, his gaze steady, not evaluating, not calculating, but present. "I meant what I said," he continued. "This is not temporary." And Naomi turned to face him fully now, her posture relaxed but grounded. "Then neither am I," she said. And the words carried a quiet strength that did not need to be raised to be heard. And something in Alexander's expression shifted again. Something deeper than respect now. Something that had been building from the moment Ethan made his choice. Something that neither of them had fully acknowledged until now. And it settled between them without urgency, without pressure, but undeniable. And from the top of the staircase a small voice called out, "Are you both still there?" And they both looked up to see Ethan standing there in his pajamas, his hair slightly messy, his expression softer now, no longer uncertain, but peaceful in a way that had not been there before. And Naomi felt something in her chest ease at the sight of him, because this, more than anything else, was what had started it all. And she moved toward the staircase without hesitation, her steps light but certain, and Ethan came down quickly, stopping just in front of her before looking between her and his father, as if confirming something he had already decided. "So it is real now," he said. And Naomi knelt slightly, so she was at his level, her voice gentle but clear. "It is real because we are making it real," she said, and Ethan smiled. A small but genuine expression that carried more weight than any approval from the outside world. And he reached for her hand again, this time not out of uncertainty, but out of belonging, and Naomi held it, not as something temporary, not as something fragile, but as something she had chosen to keep. And Alexander watched them both, understanding in that moment that what had begun as something unexpected had become something he could not reduce to a decision or a strategy. It was something real, something that required more than control. It required commitment. And as he stepped closer, standing beside them instead of apart, the distance that had once defined everything between their worlds no longer felt as absolute. And Naomi glanced at him briefly, a quiet acknowledgement passing between them, not spoken, but understood, and the house around them settled into stillness once more. But this time it felt different, not empty, not uncertain, but complete in a way that had not existed before. And outside, the world would continue to question, to challenge, to push against what they had chosen. But inside that moment, inside that space, one thing had already been decided, not by status, not by expectation, but by choice. And that was something no one could take away. And as the lights dimmed and the night finally settled, Naomi realized something that stayed with her long after the moment passed. She had not just stepped into a new life. She had stepped into a truth she had always been told was not meant for her. And instead of breaking under it, she had chosen to stand, and that choice had changed everything.